don't block the path of inquiry. Don't lay down rules that make it impossible for people to ask important questions.
Welcome to the Thought Stretchers podcast, where we hope to stretch your thinking about important issues in education through rich inquiry. My name is Drew Perkins, and I'm your host for these conversations for complexity and nuance. In this episode, I spoke with Raquel Martinez, who is the newly appointed president of the NASSP Board. NASSP stands for the National Association of Secondary School Principals, and you may remember I've had guests on before from the NASSP. Raquel is a principal out in the Pacific Northwest in Pasco, Washington, and we talked about a number of issues and how she thinks about education and her role as the newly appointed board president. One thing that is notable is she is the first Latina president to be elected or appointed, so we talked about that a bit as well. Just a note, some of you who are longtime listeners, and it's always hard to figure out who listens and when and how often you listen, but you may have noticed that we have not published a podcast in quite some time. The reason for that is that in late July, as my parents came to visit me, my mother, who was my teacher for a short bit and was a teacher and principal for many years, fell and broke her hip and shoulder, and so my bandwidth has been taken up considerably by helping to care for her. And while I really enjoy the conversations that I have on our podcast, they are not something that we make any money off of, so you can imagine that was one of the first things to go. I've rescheduled many of those guests and will continue to do so, and look forward to those conversations and publishing future episodes. But honestly, after publishing every week for many years, it's given me an opportunity to reflect on the podcast and wonder whether a weekly schedule or something different, more sporadic, monthly, or something like that might be a better path going forward. I'd love to hear any feedback that any of you might be willing to provide about your listening habits and what you would like and what you would expect. We're certainly not the biggest and most popular podcast and not aiming to be that, but in addition to being selfish about what I enjoy and the conversations I'd like to have, I would like to try to meet the needs of our listeners and folks who pay attention to this podcast in terms of guests, frequency, topics, or any other feedback that you might be willing to share. You can always reach out to me at drew@thoughtstretchers.org with that feedback or any other comments, concerns, or ideas. And with that, let's get on to the conversation with Raquel Martinez. I am with Raquel Martinez, who is newly appointed to the National Association of Secondary School Principals as the president, right? And there's new board members and all those kinds of things. We've had guests from NASSP on podcasts before, but Raquel, this is the first time you're joining us here, so welcome. As I usually like to do, I want to give you an opportunity to introduce yourself. I'm sure you're world famous in the area of Pasco, Washington, but maybe folks outside the region need a little bit of a refresher on who you are.
Yeah, no, thank you for having me. I'm really fortunate and blessed to be a part of this organization and just to be in the principalship, to be honest. So I'm going now into my 18th, 19th possibly year in education and leadership specifically, and being the principalship in the principalship, and to now I want to say my 10th year. And so I started out as a biology teacher at Pasco High School and here in Pasco, Washington, and got my first job and was a biology teacher there for a couple of years. Then I want to say my 9th year became the bilingual facilitator there, really providing professional development for our staff who are serving multilingual learners, and then was continued to get encouraged to go into leadership. And so I did and went into leadership and got a position as an assistant principal at Stevens Middle School, also in the Pasco School District. And then was fortunate enough to become the principal a couple of years after that there in that building at Stevens. Was there for a total of about 9 years. And then was again, someone tapped me on the shoulder and said, hey, it's time for you to jump to the next level and put your name in the hat for to be the planning principal of our new comprehensive high school we're building. And so that's my current position. I am the planning principal for Sageview High School in Pasco, and it's opening up next fall. And then with the NASSP work, I've been doing that. I want to say this is my 7th year. I was a board member and I was also tapped again and saying, hey, it's time for you to throw your name in the hat to, go and try to meet the board president. And so I did that and was supported through my colleagues. And here I am. It wasn't like I woke up one day or went to sleep thinking, you know what, I want to be the NASSP Board President. It didn't work that way at all. And
Young Raquel was always pining away for that position.
Yeah, no, it did not come that way by any means. The principalship is a very busy role, and but at the same time, I love collaborating and learning from others and serving others as well. So it's an opportunity there to help serve on a larger scale.
Okay, great. So just to fill in a little bit more color on the whatever the terrible analogy I'm trying to make, what was your childhood like in terms of educational? Like, where did you go to public, private? What was that K-12 kind of experience like for you?
Yeah, I went to public education. I grew up in Quincy, Washington. It's a very small farm-like area town. My parents were migrant field workers, and I also worked in the fields there, and did my, I want to say, 2nd through 12th grade there in Quincy. I loved biology, had an amazing biology teacher there at Quincy High, and then from there went to pre-med, actually. That was my course, and then couple years into that, my brother was having a tough time. My younger brother was having a tough time in high school, and he had a tough story, wasn't as successful as I was, and a lot of stories that he shared. And I honestly just said, you know what, I can be that advocate for students. And I decided to change my major from pre-med to being a biology teacher. And so, that's kind of in a nutshell how I started going into education.
Gotcha. And would you characterize, I'm curious, you talked about a biology teacher that was amazing. That teacher and any other teachers that you thought were sort of really high quality. What were some of the qualities that you noticed, or maybe in reflection said, like, this is what made them really amazing?
A couple of different things. I remember, I know him. I remember when he was trying to teach the difference between potential and kinetic energy, he stood on a chair and I'm like, what is he doing? And he was trying to get our attention. Like, this is the difference between potential. And so he used a lot of real world, like hands-on applications. I remember one year he was like riding around the school on rollerblades, and trying to teach kids, like, this is what this means. This is what this means. And so that was impactful to me. He also, I don't think he even knows this, but, words mean a lot in education, and with students. And I remember him putting on one of my report cards and sharing with me, like, you should probably consider going into science. Have you ever thought about that? And I was like, what? Oh, no. In my mind, I'm like, absolutely not. I never thought that. He's like, you're really good at this. And then it was interesting to me. So he really spoke life into me in those moments. And then another teacher was my Spanish teacher. She was awesome as well. And just showing up and being collaborative, knowing that my first language was Spanish growing up, but it's a different kind of Spanish than a traditional Spain kind of language. And so it was very much like, she was just friendly and approachable and relationship driven.
Well, I'm curious to maybe unpack a little bit about, as you're an instructional leader, right? Being a principal, being an assistant principal before, and sometimes the role of principal is probably less instructional leader than principals would like. Lots of, as you mentioned, a very busy job. My mom was a principal and tried to get me to be one. I was like, you got to be out of your mind. That's crazy talk. Who wants that job? But thankfully, some people want that job. So I'm a little curious to, I guess, capture your thoughts and how you think about instructional leadership. And when I've talked with previous guests from the NASSP and, folks who represent the organization, I'm always curious about how they think about, maybe the balance, or sometimes I would say a false dichotomy between sort of the more traditional kinds of teaching, science of learning kinds of approaches, which I think that has a lot of validity and we should be paying attention to them, but also, sort of the other end of the spectrum of the inquiry and constructivist kinds of mindsets and more experiential of what you're sort of describing with your science teacher there. So I'm curious how you think about that sort of, I call it a spectrum, and how you work with teachers and what you hope from them, I guess.
Yeah, a lot of when I work with my staff and teachers, when I was in my former building, a lot of it is based off of a collaborative. And so I have to model, as an instructional leader, I have to model what I expect. And so if I just want my teachers to stand up in the front and be the sole source of information and just like a sit and get, then I will give sit and get professional development, right? And so, but I'm not looking for that. I'm looking for knowing our students that we're serving now are very different from who even I was and others were going to school back then. And so we need to meet our students where they're at. And so I believe that, number one, making sure that I'm teaching my staff or providing professional development that meets the needs of our current students and how they're learning and what's in front of them. So modeling that as well, providing the professional development, and really still being research based on what's going to close the gap for our kids, which strategies are going to close the gap faster, make more than 1 year's growth. And so there's a lot that I can speak to in that regard, but it's very intentional in the work that we're doing, so we can get the results that we're seeking. And then that's with our staff, but then there's that whole other piece with our students as well. Engaging our students and the student voice into our instructional delivery is often overlooked.
Yeah. And as you've moved from middle school to high school, and I don't know if this is how you characterized it, but some people said, that's a step up. I don't know if it's a step up. I taught middle and then high school, and certainly a different landscape. I'm curious how that role of principal was different from middle school to high school.
There's having taught at the high school, obviously the age difference, kids laugh at your jokes at the high school, like they'll laugh with you, versus middle school, they'll cry, if you have a simple conversation. So the students and that piece of it is very different. It's, at the middle level, they're also very malleable. Like you can help shape the direction of where they're going, versus high school, they kind of already know. So I would say from the high school principal to a middle school principal, a lot of the work is very similar. You're still moving the needle with our students. It might be a different kind of needle when we're talking about graduation, when we're talking about post-graduation. What does that look like? And getting kids prepared for after high school. And so there's a lot more intentional work there. You still have the same behavior, the same professional development, the same strategies. So instructionally, it's very similar, but your focus might just be a little more narrow at the high school.
Gotcha. So what, as the president, I'm sure you had a campaign platform that you ran on, and it was well published. I'm joking.
No.
But I am curious, what do you see as some of the most pressing issues when we're thinking about education in general, K-12 education, but of course, secondary education in particular?
Yeah, I would say AI is pressing. Making sure that, and I say that broadly because, and maybe I should rephrase it in saying, really thinking about post high school. Where are kids going? How are we preparing our students for post high school? It's not about just graduating our kids. I want to be able to graduate our students with these certifications or these experiences and knowledge behind the workforce that they're going into. And so I would say And AI is a part of that. So I would say that's probably the biggest thing right now, is making sure that our students can compete in the workforce. We're, as principals, we're the gatekeepers of our buildings. And so what happens in our buildings are what we allow in the systems that we put into place. So it's important that we take that work to heart, and put those systems in place for our students.
So what kinds of things are you trying to do? Are you trying to get them involved in I guess, experiencing and using and leveraging AI? And of course, there's the other side of that, as that their students are using it in ways that are sort of circumventing the teaching and learning process, asking it to write papers and those kinds of things.
Yeah, no, I think one of the pieces just in that subheading with AI, I would say we need to make sure that there's a common understanding of what it is. And it's really as a thought partner. You can you have to input first. So what are you inputting, and what does that look like? Well, I might write up my synopsis or my summary on this. Great. You want someone to look it over, or maybe I need to change some languages here or some verbs here or what have you. And so it's a thought partner. It's as a resource. It's not necessarily doing the work for you, because ultimately it has to be productive. It has to be saying, even if you're just using one ChatGPT, for example, it's not going to sound like you. It's not going to look like, so you have to put your own information. And so it's applying those specific skills as well. So I think everyone needs to have a common understanding, or students need to have a common understanding of how to use it, what it's used for. It's not hey, go do this for me, because then you're not learning anything out of that. So it's how do you use it, and what are the benefits of it? Again, that's just a subheading to the holistic picture of getting our students ready for post-high school.
I'm curious too about the extent, and I think this is, I think it seems to be manifesting differently in many ways, sort of regionally, but some of the culture war kinds of things that we read about and hear about and see in the news and on social media and all of those kinds of things, I'm skeptical of some of the claims. I certainly have some concerns about some of the claims, but I do, and I've talked about it here on the podcast a number of times, it seems that geographically and demographically, some of those things look much different. I'm in Kentucky, so rural Kentucky is going to look much different than, let's say Los Angeles or Seattle or something like that. I'm curious how you're seeing, or what you're seeing in terms of those kinds of external pressures and internal pressures and things that students are talking about, wondering about. Again, we're seeing lots of things with board meetings and parents being either upset or frustrated and those kinds of things.
That, I think that's a tough one, because there's so many varying opinions and thoughts. I do know our students, they're aware of some of it, but it's important that, and how they're handling it, and is really open from what I've seen. They're very open to learning about what's the discussion, what's happening, what are the different views that are circulating around us. And so it's one thing to get the information, but it's another thing to actually elevating the student's voice behind it. So it's not just about them just hearing bits and pieces of information. It's purposely providing, here, let me provide you the whole context on these different views or things like that. And so, that's a tough one, because I've heard a lot of mixed information on kids' thoughts and how that's affecting them in school.
Right. As far as principals and school leaders around the country, to the extent that, and I think you're pretty new in this role, but you've obviously been associated with NASSP for some time. Are you hearing, or are there discussions when there are convenings and conferences, and what do those conversations sound like when school leaders are talking, and maybe they're not talking about them? I can't imagine they're not, because it seems like it's ever present, but I'm just curious.
Talking about which part specifically, because there's a lot out there.
Yeah, I mean any of it. I mean, we see the videos of parents at school boards acting terribly. The issues of books and grooming, and I mean, you name it. I'm sure you've seen it. Principals being one of the first lines of defense because, as I said, it seems like a terrible job because every stakeholder in the system is pointing right at you and saying, why don't you fix this? And they act like you have all this power to just snap your fingers and do these things. But I'm just really, are the principals feeling those pressures and
Yes.
and
Yes.
how do they? What are some of the ways in which they're trying to work through them, or suggestions, or does the organization have suggestions, or
Yeah.
try to do this or try not to do that kind of thing?
Yeah. So yes, the pressure is there, and yes, I have seen those and have witnessed um, community kind of being very active in how they're providing input on just different decisions or things that are coming down from our state level. Um, so so there's different ways that I know our organization helps to connect principals so they don't feel so isolated.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the ways that we do that is really through our leadership networks. And so we have a number of leadership networks where I, as a building principal, can connect with other high school principals or middle level principals or what have you. So we have several of them, and so that's one avenue that we take and we recommend and we push out. So again, we're not isolated. And then we also have our local state associations as well, where they also connect with the national level, but our state associations also do a great job in connecting with building principals on their own networks and feeling supported when these items do come up. And I say that because let's say you and I are on the same network. Hey, I can share information with you. It's a safe place. So have you gone through something like this? What is your district doing? What are we doing? And how did you navigate? What are the resources available to help navigate those difficult situations sometimes? But yeah, it's often, sometimes it's hurtful information. And sometimes it's a lot of pressure on you got to do it this way or you got to do it this way. And it's really unfortunate. But again, having our networks to be able to connect with others is honestly probably one of our top resources to help our principals.
Okay, so as the president, El Presidente, what are the sort of roles and responsibilities? What are you supposed to be doing as a sort of job description? And maybe a better follow-up question to that is, what do you hope to accomplish in that I don't know, is it a year term?
Yeah, so my normal duties really is really directing and supporting our board, and then working with our CEO on just the whole system in general and how we're navigating and moving the system forward based on our strategic goals and things that we're working on as a collaborative. My hopes for this year is to continue to connect with other states, other principals. I love talking to principals because I'm learning as well. So it's as much as they're learning from me, and if I'm going to speak or what have you, and they're gaining, whatever they're gaining, I'm also love to have conversations on, hey, what's working here? What's working there? And it's so amazing to hear what resources are available from just each other. I was able to meet with a principal from Hawaii the other day, and she was talking about her high school and the things that she's doing. I'm like, I need to steal that idea. Can you walk me through that? Oh, yeah. Here's how I did it. And here's how I went. Okay, cool. Awesome. And so, and then, hey, when's the next time we're going to meet to collaborate on this or what have you. And so that's my hopes are to continue to connect with building principals. Would be great to be able to connect with Title I schools. That's where my heart is working with our underperforming students or our minority students or underrepresented students. And then also, it'd be great to be able to work with other Latina principals who maybe are in our building principals and aren't spotlighted or highlighted, and really encouraging them as well, or other leaders of color as well. And so those are my hopes for this year, and obviously to have a successful year with our NASSP board and continue to moving the needle and filling the stadium, right? We want to be able to fill a stadium with principals' voices on a number of issues, and something Ron talks about often, and oftentimes as building principals, we think our voice is like this, super tiny, and it's really like, no, it isn't. As a collective, here's what it is. Let's advocate. This is how you advocate. This is what that looks like. So just walking alongside your CEO as well and supporting what he's doing with our organization. So those are some of the hopes that I have for this year.
Okay, good. And one of the things, as you sort of alluded to there, and I don't think we've identified, but as I understand, you're the first Latina president, and not the first woman president, but first Latina president. I'm curious if you maybe would say a little bit more about why that's important, why you feel that's important, some of the reasons why, I guess expounding on some of the things that you said, and then, are there any things sort of, I guess, pitfalls or things that, identity being an important thing, but sometimes, at least in my opinion, they can cause some problems, or there can be some pitfalls, some things to avoid, identitarianism and that kind of thing. And so I'm curious how you think about that, and maybe can you expound on some of those things?
Yeah, remember when I started out, I didn't wake up one day and say, hey, I want to be I want to be the first Latina to be in 100 years. Like I was not seeking this out. But it's just someone recognized along the way, along just being on the board and all of the leadership opportunities I've had, what I like to call tapped, talent and potential. Someone recognized that and tapped me on the shoulder. I probably needed to be like shoved, like, go, you're moving. And oftentimes I think it's important to recognize that a lot of leaders of color, don't get tapped. Or they have to get pushed, to really move in that direction, because there's just a understanding. I know I was very much so, and sometimes I still struggle a little bit with the imposter syndrome. Is like, what am I doing here? What's happening? How did I get here? So I think it's important to elevate our leaders of color, but then also the students that we're serving. We're understanding that our students there's a lot of diversity within the students that we're serving across the U.S. And I believe that having leaders of color in positions of, for example, the presidency, allows and opens the doors for other students as well to be able to grow in their leadership. It wasn't, I would say, 2 years ago, maybe a year and a half ago, we were at one of our student conferences in DC, and I was at a roundtable with students, and these students, there were leaders within their building. I think they were from Chicago, and I was translating for them, and part of what I was saying and speaking from what the guest speaker was speaking to the whole group, there had to have been maybe 300 students in there, but they were talking about just mental health awareness and things like that with students. And one of the students looked at me and she said to me, I'm going to do this. I'm going to do this. And I'm going to do this in English, but my problem is that I don't know how to share this post in English, because that's not my first language. And in my mind, I'm like, well, multilingualism isn't a deficit. Knowing a second language isn't a deficit, or learning a second language isn't a deficit. And so I share this story because as soon as I shared that with her, she just, like, something changed, like, immediately. And she was like, wow, like, I can do this. I'm going to do this way. And so to me, why it's important to be the first Latina, NASSP Board President or leader of color is really for those moments, right? When students can see others that look like them, maybe sound like them, what have you, that they can also be leaders. And so I would love to be able to inspire others to lean into that, because I definitely wasn't leaning into that. But others were leaning into that, or speaking life into me in that regard. So would love to be able to do that as well.
I agree with all of that, and to sort of circle back on one of the things, are there things that are sort of things that you might caution or wonder or worry about in terms of going too heavily or too, I guess, emphasizing identity and things like that too much? One of the things from my perspective I wonder about is in some of those conversations, it seems sometimes like the group identity of whatever that group identity might be is sometimes feels like it's a higher priority than our shared humanity, and that becomes an emphasis that becomes a problem in the ways that we're interacting, and it leads to some really odd things that feel like it's going backwards in some ways, even though it maybe feels like we're supposed to, it's in the name of going forward. But I'm curious, when you think about those things or how you think about those things.
Yeah, I agree. I've seen some of that and heard some of that as well. And to me, it kind of goes back to my core values that, it's about all of us. I'm not here to serve some of our kids. I'm here to serve all of our kids. And as a leader, that's pouring into others means pouring into all of the students. And so I'm not, although, yes, I totally understand when others say, oh my gosh, like you're the first Latina. Oh my gosh. And in my mind, I'm like, but it's just me.
Right.
It's just a person.
And you didn't choose to be Latina.
Yeah, I didn't choose this. This is just who I am, but I know that it helps others, right? But really at my core is really to help all versus just some. And so my message and things that I share with others, it's again goes back to just serving. I'm here to help serve in whatever capacity, and never want to create division in any way. It's really something that we do together collaboratively.
Are there any things, sometimes in our workshops when we work with teachers and our professional development sessions, we ask them to create a sort of what we call an ideal graduate. What are the characteristics, traits, and attributes of a student that you would ideally like them to have once they matriculate on beyond high school, or maybe even your classroom, or whatever level you want to set it at? When you think about that kind of set of characteristics and traits as a principal of your school, and maybe nationally as the president, what are some of those? And you say, well, we really should be focusing on these things.
Yeah, I would say to respond to that is based off of I've had the opportunity to sit with a lot of our community. Gosh, what's the word I'm looking for? Our vendors, our community partners, business partners. Thank you, community business partners, and it's working in collaboration with them. That's ultimately our kids are going to leave us, right? So they're going to. You
sure hope so, right? For their sake and ours.
Yeah. And so and going into the workforce. So it's gleaning information from our community partners, and then also what do our kids need in the current school system to help get to that point. And so I would say they have to be able to be critical thinkers. They have to be able to have, that customer service, soft skills, let's say, where I can have a conversation. I can also advocate for myself. That's probably one of the biggest ones that I've heard from different employers is kids just need to they need to ask the question. They're not asking the question for themselves. They're just kind of sitting there and waiting. And I noticed that with my 16-year-old. I'm like, have you asked this question to your school counselor? No. Well, why? Let's consider that. Well, okay. And so it's some of those skills I would say, and then honestly being forward thinking is if I do this, then here are the impacts of that. And so those are some of the components that have been shared with me from our community partners, and I've heard across the states when I've had conversations with other principals.
And I know you have to go, you're a principal and busy, but maybe the last question here that's a follow-up. Instructionally, what are some of the things that you focus on and want your teachers and instruction to look like? How do you want instruction to look like to try to get there?
Yeah, that's a heavy question. There's a lot of different components in that.
It's a great exit question, right?
I'm like, oh, geez. As a building principal, I got to make sure that my systems are in place.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I say my systems are in place, like it's intentional. So if I'm expecting my staff, like I shared before, if I'm expecting my staff to, here's what we're going to do for tier 1 instruction, then I got to model that. So everyone is going to get, let's say, entry tasks, or I'm going to do AVID strategies, or PLC. We're going to PLC, and we're going to look at data, or what have you. Then I'm going to model that, create the professional development for the staff. At the same time, however, I have to make sure that my staff has these experiences of what it's going to look like, what it looks like after high school. So one of the things that we're doing right now in planning, let's say, our building, and even just looking at our high school systems are, let's say if you're a teacher in my building and our signature program is in ag science, then you might not know, in your mind, you might think, oh, ag science, you're working on a farm. And that's all your level of understanding goes. Well, it's my job as a building principal is to expose you to that as much as possible, whether it's through externships, whatever it is, so that I can paint the picture for you, so you can paint the picture for our students. And so, and then that teacher voice and that collaborative as we're designing professional development, so our kids do graduate with these specific skills. And so it's not just me, it's a collaborative working together with my staff.
Gotcha. Okay, well, like I said, I know that you are busy, and there's more depth I could try to pull out from you on that heavy question and some other questions. But I want to honor your time and thank you for coming on. So Raquel Martinez is her name. Anything else that you want to say that we haven't talked about, or anything else you want to share?
No, I just appreciate the opportunity, and I'm excited for this year.
Okay, great. Well, thank you again for the conversation, and as always, I hope it's helpful.
Thank you.
What we need to do is spend enough time together that we can start to translate our ideas into each other's language and include one another in this community of inquiry. And that is the work of love.